In this video, we're going to look at example 1 from section 3.7, where we identify even and odd functions from their graphs. So we're asked, or we're told, to use the graph to classify the polynomial function, and we're trying to determine if it is even, odd, or neither. So the first thing, let's start to test if it is even. And if it's even, remember we're reflecting over the y-axis. All right, so let's test for even first. So what I'm going to do is, or actually no, let's phrase that better. Let's ask ourselves what happens when we reflect over the y-axis. That's a little bit better of a question, it's much more specific. So if I take my graph and I reflect it over the y-axis, if I kind of think to mirror it, you're going to get something like, oh, that was terrible. You're going to get something that looks like this. Let's try that one more time. Having some trouble here. Maybe something that looks like that. Again, not perfect, but we get the general idea. Clearly, those are not the same on the left and the right side. If I split that graph in half, left and right are different. So what happens when we reflect over the x-axis? We get a different graph, or a new graph. And since we get a new graph, then we know that this is not even. Okay, so now we need to see if it's odd. So the next question we can ask is, what happens when we rotate 180 degrees about the origin? So we want to rotate about the origin. So my origin's here. If I was to trace my graph, not close enough, and I select that, and then I'm going to rotate that 180 degrees, I wind up with the same graph. All right, so what that tells me is that my answer, it's the same graph. So then my function is odd. So what I would state is that the function is odd. All right, and now remember, it's because we rotated 180 degrees about the origin, and we got that same graph. So I'm going to erase those markings. You could also test points, and that's usually the case of what you want to do. So up here we have the point 1, 1. I should wind up with the complete opposite, and that point there would be -1, -1. So that's a good sign that, and confirms that my function is in fact odd. So let's go on to part B. I know these look a little different. So part B would be the second graph. And if I was to split this in half, so let's go to our first question. What happens when we reflect over the y-axis? And we want to ask ourselves, is this left side the exact same as this right side? Well, definitely looks the case to me. So we're gonna say that that is the same graph. We'll test it just in a second. So then it is even. Since we know that the graph is even, we don't even need a test to see if it's odd. All right, once we know one of them, it can't be the other. It's impossible for it to be an odd function and an even function. So we know that this is an even function, so we can just say the function is even. We don't need to continue to test for anything else. And just to confirm that, here I have the point 1, 2, 1, 2. And then this point over here, my x value should be -1, but my y value should be the same, and it is. All right, these 2 points are the same distance from the y-axis. And then finally, let's get rid of that, that's confusing. Part C, same questions. We're going to ask ourselves, what happens when we reflect over the y-axis? Well, if I reflect over the y-axis, the left and right sides, this piece clearly is not the same as this piece. So what happens? Well, we get a new graph. So that means it's not even. So we ask the next question, see if it's odd. What happens when we rotate? Oops. What happens when we rotate 180 degrees about the origin? So it's really important that you rotate about the origin, not like a center of the graph. There should be a question mark up there. So if I trace this graph here, so if I'm tracing this, I need to reflect across that origin. So do be very careful with that. So here it's reflecting across the middle. So when I reflect 180 degrees, I do not get the same graph. So clearly that's not the same. You don't want a reflection point from here. Okay, we're not trying to reflect from the center, rotate from the center of the graph. We are rotating about the origin. All right, so this piece would have to rotate around that. Do be careful with that. So same as before, we get a new graph. So that tells me that it is not odd. So what that means is that the function is neither odd nor even. Right. So it's neither. Part A, it was rotated about the origin, so that tells us that it was odd. Function B was even because the left and the right sides about the y-axis were the same, they were symmetrical. And in part C, they weren't symmetrical over the y-axis, and if we rotated about the origin, we got a new graph, so it also wasn't odd, so part C would be neither. So let's zoom out so you can see all three at the same time. And that's really it. So you just have to look left to right and rotation to determine even or odd. If neither one of those is true, then the graph is neither. It's that straightforward.